The dust hadn't even settled from the Mustang's hooves when Clementine realized the woman cornering her wasn't there to help. 3 hours earlier, she'd been just another homeless teen scraping for survival behind the general store, but now something wild and impossible had just charged down from the hills to save her life. Clementine pressed her back against the wooden fence, her torn dress catching on the rough planks. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town, and she could taste the desperation in her dry mouth. She'd been hiding in the alley between buildings, searching through discarded crates for anything edible, when the woman appeared. Maud Bishop moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. Her dark dress was finely made, her boots polished, and her smile never reached her cold eyes. She had cornered Clementine with the precision of a predator, blocking the only exit from the narrow space. "There's no need to run, child," Maud said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I have work for a girl like you. Good work that pays well." Clementine's stomach clenched with more than hunger. She'd heard about Maud's work from other girls who'd whispered warnings in the darkness. Girls who'd disappeared or returned broken, their eyes hollow and their spirits crushed. The kind of work that destroyed young women and left them with nothing but shame and scars. She tried to dart past Maud, but the older woman was faster than she looked. Strong hands grabbed Clementine's wrists, fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. The fence pressed against her spine, trapping her completely. "Let me go," Clementine whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her racing heart. Maud's grip tightened. "You don't have a choice, dear. A girl with no family, no money, no prospects. You should be grateful someone's willing to invest in you." That's when Clementine heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the quiet morning air. Hoof beats. Not the measured clip-clop of a saddle horse, but something wilder, more urgent. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and dust started rising in the distance. Maud heard it too. Her head turned toward the sound, her confident expression flickering with confusion. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, accompanied by something else that made Clementine's blood freeze. A sound like thunder, but wrong somehow, as if the very earth was about to split open. But what she saw charging toward them from the hills would change everything she thought she knew about survival. The Mustang burst into view like a force of nature unleashed. Coal black with a white blaze down his face, muscles rippling beneath his coat as he thundered down the hillside toward the town. But this wasn't some mystical rescue. This was raw panic. Clementine could see the terror in the animal's eyes, the way his nostrils flared wide, foam flying from his mouth. Something had spooked him badly up in those hills, and he was running blind, crashing through whatever stood in his path. The horse wasn't coming to save anyone. He was running for his life. Maud's grip loosened as she stared at the approaching chaos. What in blazes? The Mustang hit the main street like a thunderbolt, scattering chickens and sending people diving for cover. A merchant's cart overturned, spilling apples that rolled across the dirt road. Women screamed from doorways as the terrified animal careened between buildings, his hooves striking sparks off the stones. Clementine saw her chance. She twisted free from Maud's momentarily weakened grasp and bolted toward the street, but her escape route led directly into the path of the panicked horse. She could feel the ground shaking beneath her bare feet as the Mustang bore down on her. Time seemed to slow as she realized her mistake. She'd traded one deadly situation for another. The horse's eyes rolled white with terror, and she knew he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. At the last second, Clementine threw herself sideways, hitting the ground hard and rolling behind a water trough. The Mustang thundered past so close that his tail whipped across her face. She lay there gasping, tasting dirt and blood from where she'd bitten her tongue. "You little fool!" Maud's voice cut through the chaos. The woman was advancing on her again, but now she looked furious instead of merely predatory. "Look what you've done!" Clementine pushed herself up on her elbows, watching the Mustang continue his rampage down the street. That's when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The horse had a rope around his neck. Not a halter or bridle, but a crude lariat that had been pulled tight, cutting into his flesh and driving him to madness with pain and fear. Someone had been trying to capture this animal, someone cruel enough to use methods that tortured rather than tamed. "He's hurt," Clementine whispered, more to herself than to Maud. "He's dangerous," Maud snapped, grabbing Clementine's arm again. "And so are the men who'll be coming after him. Men who don't ask questions about what they find in their way." As if summoned by her words, The sound of approaching riders echoed from the hills. Heavy hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast and purposeful. Clementine's heart sank as she realized the Mustang's terror hadn't been random. The hunters were coming, and from the look in Maud's eyes, they weren't the kind of men who'd be particular about witnesses. 4 riders crested the hill like harbingers of violence. Their leader was a man with scars that told stories of countless fights, his hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much cruelty. They rode hard toward the town, and the way Maud's face went pale told Clementine everything she needed to know. These weren't just horse hunters, they were Maud's partners. Cyrus Monroe, Maud breathed, and there was genuine fear in her voice now. He wasn't supposed to come down here. The Mustang had reached the far end of the street, cornered against the blacksmith's shop. The animal spun in circles, the rope cutting deeper into his neck with each panicked movement. Blood stained his black coat, and his breathing came in harsh, labored gasps. Clementine felt something crack inside her chest as she watched the magnificent creature's agony. She'd spent her life being cornered, trapped, hunted by people who saw her as nothing more than prey. Looking at that horse, she saw herself. "We have to help him," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Maud laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Help him? Child, that animal is worth more money than this entire town will see in a year. Cyrus and his men have been tracking that bloodline for months." Bloodline? That's not just any Mustang. His dam was stolen from a cavalry post 3 years ago. Best breeding stock in the territory. The foal that got away. Maud's eyes gleamed with greed, despite her fear. Cyrus has buyers lined up from here to California. The riders thundered into town, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Cyrus Monroe dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to violence, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. His companions spread out, boxing in the terrified Mustang. "Maud," Cyrus called, his voice carrying the weight of authority and menace. "Fancy meeting you here. Just happened to be in town," Maud replied, but her grip on Clementine's arm tightened to the point of pain. Cyrus's gaze swept over Clementine, taking in her torn dress, her bare feet, her obvious hunger. And who might this be? Nobody important, just a street girl. But Cyrus was already walking toward them, and something in his expression made Clementine's skin crawl. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men who viewed women as commodities to be bought and sold. "Nobody important?" Cyrus reached out and lifted a strand of Clementine's dark hair, letting it fall through his fingers. "Pretty little thing. Could be useful." The Mustang's scream of pain cut through the air as one of the riders tightened the rope around his neck. But it was Cyrus's next words that made Clementine's blood freeze. "Tell me, Maud, does she know what really happened to her parents?" The words hit Clementine like a physical blow. She'd been told her parents died in a wagon accident when she was small, that she'd been the only survivor found by travelers days later. But the way Cyrus spoke, the way Maud couldn't meet her eyes, told a different story entirely. "What are you talking about?" Clementine's voice came out smaller than she intended. Cyrus smiled, and it was the coldest thing she'd ever seen. "Your father owned a piece of land up in those hills. Good water, better grass, perfect for raising horses." He gestured toward the struggling Mustang. "That animal's dam was pastured there before we acquired her." "Cyrus," Maud warned, but there was no real authority in her voice. "The man wouldn't sell," Cyrus continued, circling Clementine like a predator. "Stubborn fool thought he could stand against progress, so we made him an offer he couldn't refuse." The pieces crashed together in Clementine's mind with horrible clarity. Her parents hadn't died in an accident. They'd been murdered for their land, and she'd been left to die in the wilderness. Only luck and the kindness of strangers had kept her alive. "You killed them," she whispered. "Business is business." Cyrus shrugged as if discussing the weather. "And now that business includes you. Maud here was supposed to bring you in quietly, but you've caused quite a commotion." Maud's face flushed red. The girl was more trouble than expected. "She's wild, like her father." The Mustang let out another scream, and Clementine saw one of the riders raising a thick stick to strike the animal. Something inside her snapped. All the years of running, hiding, surviving on scraps while her parents' killers profited from their murder. All the fear and hunger and desperation crystallized into pure rage. She bit down hard on Maud's hand, tasting blood as the woman screamed and released her grip. Then Clementine was running, not away from the chaos but straight toward it. "Get her!" Cyrus roared. But Clementine was already at the Mustang's side. The horse reared back, nearly striking her with his hooves. But she ducked under his flailing legs and grabbed the rope cutting into his neck. Her fingers worked frantically at the knot, slippery with blood and sweat. "Easy," she whispered to the terrified animal. "Easy, boy. I know what it's like." The rope came free just as heavy hands grabbed her shoulders. But the Mustang was already moving, no longer trapped by the cruel lariat. He spun toward his tormentors with fury in his eyes, and Clementine realized she'd just unleashed 1,500 pounds of vengeful horseflesh in the middle of a crowded street. What she didn't realize was that she'd also signed her own death warrant. Because Cyrus Monroe never let anyone cost him money and lived to tell about it, the freed Mustang exploded into motion like a thunderclap made flesh. Without the rope choking him, the animal's rage found its true target. He reared up on his hind legs, iron-shod hooves flashing in the sunlight as they crashed down inches from the nearest rider's head. Chaos erupted in the street. Cyrus's men scattered, their own horses rearing and plunging in terror. One rider went down hard, his mount bucking him off into the dirt where he lay groaning and clutching his arm. The Mustang spun and charged another man, teeth bared, forcing him to leap behind a water trough for safety. In the confusion, the hands gripping Clementine's shoulders loosened. She twisted free and dove between the legs of a rearing horse, rolling to safety behind an overturned wagon. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself flat against the wooden planks. "Control that beast!" Cyrus roared, drawing his gun. But he couldn't get a clear shot with his own men scrambling for cover and townspeople running in every direction. The Mustang seemed to understand he was outnumbered. With one final defiant scream, he wheeled and galloped toward the edge of town, heading for the open grassland beyond. Dust clouds marked his escape route as he disappeared into the rolling hills. But Clementine's moment of triumph was short-lived. Strong hands seized her again, and this time they belonged to Cyrus himself. His fingers dug into her arm hard enough to leave bruises as he hauled her to her feet. "That animal was worth $500, he hissed in her ear. "Now you owe me, and I always collect my debts." Maud approached cautiously, dabbing at the bite marks on her hand with a handkerchief. "What do we do with her now?" Half the town saw what happened. Cyrus's smile was sharp as a blade. "We stick to the original plan. Girl like this goes missing. Nobody asks questions. Street orphans disappear all the time." But as he spoke, Clementine noticed something that made her pulse quicken with hope. The townspeople hadn't all run away. Some of them lingered in doorways and behind windows watching. She recognized the blacksmith, a massive man named Porter Dale, who'd sometimes given her odd jobs in exchange for food. His expression was thunderous as he took in the scene. "Cyrus Monroe," Porter called out, stepping into the street. His hammer hung from his belt, and his arms were thick with muscle from years at the forge. "Seems like you're causing quite a disturbance in our town. Nothing that concerns you." "Blacksmith." Cyrus kept his grip on Clementine, but his other hand moved to rest on his gun butt. "Just collecting what's mine. Funny thing about that," Porter said, and other men began emerging from their hiding places. The shopkeeper, the barber, even old Dr. Whitmore with his medical bag. "We all heard what you said about this girl's parents. About business being business." Clementine felt Cyrus tense beside her. For the first time since his arrival, uncertainty flickered across his scarred features. His 3 remaining men were injured or scattered, and now he faced a growing crowd of angry townspeople. But what happened next would determine whether justice or violence ruled the day. Cyrus's hand moved faster than thought, his gun clearing leather in one smooth motion. But instead of aiming at the approaching townspeople, he pressed the cold barrel against Clementine's temple. The metal bit into her skin like ice, and she forced herself to remain perfectly still. "Easy now," Cyrus called out, his voice steady despite being outnumbered. "Nobody needs to get hurt here. Just a simple misunderstanding between business partners." Porter Dale stopped advancing, but his eyes burned with fury. "Business partners don't murder families for their land." "You heard wrong," Cyrus said smoothly. "That girl's been living on the street so long. She started believing her own fantasies. Her parents died in an accident, just like everyone was told." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "I treated wagon accident victims for 30 years, Monroe. Never saw one where the wheels had been deliberately loosened and the brake lines cut clean through." The words hit like a thunderbolt. Even Maud's face went white as she stared at Cyrus with new understanding. Clementine felt the world spin around her as the full scope of her parents' murder became clear. It hadn't been a quick death. They'd been sabotaged, left to die slowly when their wagon inevitably crashed. You're walking on thin ice. Doc, Cyrus warned, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Am I? Dr. Whitmore's voice grew stronger. Because I kept detailed notes from that examination. Notes that might interest a federal marshal if one were to happen by. Cyrus's grip on the gun tightened, and Clementine felt the barrel press harder against her skull. You're all making a big mistake. I've got friends in high places, men who won't appreciate you interfering with legitimate business. What friends? Porter demanded. The territorial governor who's been trying to clean up corruption? The new marshal service that's been tracking horse thieves from here to Mexico? For the first time, genuine fear flickered in Cyrus's eyes. His operation had depended on operating in shadows, bribing local officials, and staying ahead of territorial law. But times were changing, and men like him were becoming relics of a lawless past. Here's what's going to happen, Cyrus said, backing toward his horse while keeping Clementine as a shield. I'm going to ride out of here and this girl comes with me. Insurance, you might say. Anyone follows and she dies. But as he reached for his horse's reins, a new sound echoed from the hills. Hoofbeats again, but different this time. Multiple riders, moving in formation, their pace steady and purposeful rather than desperate. Maud pointed toward the rising dust cloud. Cyrus, look! 5 men in dark coats crested the hill, riding in a tight line. Even from a distance, the star-shaped badges on their chests caught the sunlight. Federal marshals, arriving as if summoned by the mention of their name. Cyrus cursed under his breath, his carefully laid plans crumbling like sand. But a cornered predator was the most dangerous kind, and Clementine realized her ordeal was far from over. Because desperate men did desperate things, and Cyrus Monroe had just run out of options. The lead marshal was a lean man with silver hair and eyes like winter steel. Marshal Wade Langston had been tracking Cyrus Monroe's gang for 6 months, following a trail of stolen horses and murdered homesteaders across 3 territories. The badge on his chest wasn't just metal. It was a promise that the lawless days were ending. Cyrus Monroe, Marshal Langston called out as he and his men spread into a line. You're under arrest for horse theft, murder, and racketeering. Cyrus laughed, but it sounded hollow. You've got no jurisdiction here, Marshal. This is territorial business. Actually, we do. Langston held up a rolled document. Federal warrant, signed by the territorial governor himself. Seems your business associates in the capital got tired of your bribes and decided to cooperate. The gun against Clementine's head trembled slightly. She could feel Cyrus's desperation growing with each passing second. His remaining men had melted away, abandoning him to save themselves. Even Maud was backing toward the shadows, her face pale with terror. The girl comes with me, Cyrus declared, edging toward his horse. I walk away clean, or she dies right here. No deal, Langston said firmly, but I'll give you one chance. Release the girl, surrender peacefully, and you'll live to see trial. Keep this up, and you won't leave this street alive. Clementine felt Cyrus's hand shake against her shoulder. The man who'd terrorized the territory with his cruelty was finally facing consequences, and fear was eating him alive. But that made him more dangerous, not less. You think I'm afraid to die? Cyrus snarled. I've killed better men than all of you. Maybe, Dr. Whitmore said, stepping closer despite the gun. But you never killed anyone who mattered. Just innocent families trying to build honest lives. Shut up, Cyrus screamed. And the gun swung away from Clementine toward the doctor. It was the opening she'd been waiting for. Years of surviving on the streets had taught her to recognize the exact moment when attention shifted. She drove her elbow back into Cyrus's ribs with all her strength, then dropped to the ground as his grip loosened. The gun fired, the bullet going wild over Dr. Whitmore's head. But before Cyrus could aim again, Porter Dale's hammer flew through the air, striking his wrist with a sickening crack. The weapon tumbled from his broken fingers. Marshal Langston was moving before the gun hit the dirt, tackling Cyrus to the ground. The 2 men struggled briefly, but Cyrus was finished. His wrist hung at an unnatural angle, and defeat weighed down his shoulders like lead. Cyrus Monroe, Langston panted, snapping iron shackles around the outlaw's good wrist. You're under arrest for the murders of Thomas and Sarah Ross, among other charges. Clementine's breath caught. Those were her parents' names. Names she'd almost forgotten after years of having no one to speak them. Now they would be remembered, and their killers would face justice. But one question remained unanswered, and its resolution would determine whether this story ended in triumph or tragedy. 6 months later, Clementine stood on the porch of the house her father had built, watching the black Mustang graze peacefully in the meadow below. The horse had returned on his own 3 days after the confrontation, drawn back to the good grass and clean water of the Ross family land. He bore scars from the rope, but time and careful tending had healed his wounds. Marshall Langston had kept his word. Cyrus Monroe was tried and convicted for multiple murders, including that of Thomas and Sarah Ross. He would spend the rest of his life in the territorial prison. His days of terrorizing honest families finally ended. Maude Bishop had received 5 years for her role in the conspiracy, her fine clothes traded for a prison uniform. The federal investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected. Cyrus's operation stretched across 4 territories, involving dozens of stolen horses and at least 12 murdered homesteaders. The network of corrupt officials who'd protected him crumbled once the evidence came to light. Dr. Whitmore had been true to his word about his detailed notes from her parents' accident. The evidence of sabotage was undeniable, and it helped seal Cyrus's fate. More importantly, it proved that Thomas and Sarah Ross had been murdered for their land, making Clementine the rightful heir to everything they'd built. Porter Dale approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He'd agreed to help manage the property until Clementine came of age, teaching her the practical skills she'd need to run a ranch. In return, he used the blacksmith shop her father had built, serving the growing community that had sprung up around the good water and grass. "That Mustang's put on weight," Porter observed, joining her on the porch. "Amazing what kindness can do after so much cruelty." Clementine nodded, watching the horse's muscles ripple beneath his glossy coat. She'd named him Freedom, though she never used the name aloud. Some things were too precious for words. The town below had grown since the events of that violent morning. Word had spread about the community that stood up to outlaws and corruption. Honest families arrived weekly, drawn by the promise of justice and the protection of federal law. The wild frontier was becoming civilized, one decent person at a time. "Letter came for you today," Porter said, handing her an envelope. From the territorial capital. Clementine opened it carefully, her reading skills much improved after months of tutoring from Dr. Whitmore. The letter was from the territorial governor himself, officially recognizing her ownership of the Ross family holdings and expressing the territory's gratitude for her role in exposing the Monroe Gang. But the most important line was at the bottom. "By territorial decree, this land shall remain in the Ross family name in perpetuity, a testament to the courage of those who refuse to let evil triumph." As the sun set behind the hills, Clementine felt a deep peace settle over her. Her parents' murders had been avenged, their land reclaimed, and their memory honored. The frightened street orphan was gone, replaced by a young woman with purpose, property, and the respect of her community. The Mustang lifted his head from the grass and looked toward her, as if sensing her thoughts. Then he returned to grazing, content in his freedom and safety. Justice had been served, debts had been paid, and life had triumphed over death. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
2 officers were patrolling the snowy streets of a quiet Colorado town. Then came a low, weary growl. A lone German shepherd stood in the middle of the road, eyes cloudy with age, fur matted by frost, and a scar that whispered of battles no one remembered. They raised their guns. He didn't move. He didn't growl. He just waited like he'd been here before. What happened next uncovered a story long buried, a betrayal, a reunion, and a loyalty that outlived even memory. What you're about to witness will break your heart and then put it back together again. Before we start, do you have a dog of your own? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to know who's watching alongside their furry best friend. And if you believe that no hero man or dog should ever be forgotten, hit that subscribe button, because this story might just change how you see every old paw print left behind. The snow had swallowed Whitestone whole. At 6:42 a.m., the small Colorado mountain town lay frozen under a thick, white hush. The streets were deserted. Rooftops slouched under weighty snowdrifts, and power lines buzzed softly in the cold air. The sun had not yet risen, but the world had already turned blue with frost. In a place where even deer stepped lightly, something else moved that morning. something heavy, something lost. Officer Brian Keller steered the patrol cruiser cautiously down Millstone Avenue, the tires crunching ice in measured rhythm. At 27, he still looked like the boy who used to chase dogs in the backyard, but grief had added weight to his eyes and jaw. He had his father's build-solid shoulders, steady hands, and his mother's softness, though he'd buried that long ago. His father, Chief Daniel Keller, had been the pride of Whitestone, until he wasn't. 5 years dead, and people still whispered his name like a question no one wanted answered. Beside Brian sat Officer Cooper Diaz, tall and stiff in the passenger seat. 25, angular, with skin like polished oak and a high and tight haircut that always looked fresh. His uniform was immaculate. His boots didn't show a single scuff. He didn't believe in gut feelings. Cooper was a rulebook man, raised in Denver by a single mother and 2 sisters who ran their house like a drill sergeant ran barracks. He didn't like surprises, and he didn't like dogs. "Another blizzard's rolling in tonight," Cooper said, eyes scanning the frost-framed windshield. Brian sipped burnt coffee from a steel thermos. "Just what we need. Snow on top of snow." Then Cooper leaned forward, brows tightening. "Wait, stop the car." Brian braked. "What?" "There, look." Cooper pointed. A figure stood at the far end of the street. Through the snowfall it looked like a shadow. But as the cruiser rolled slowly forward, its shape became clear. A German shepherd, standing square in the middle of the road. It wasn't moving. The dog was large, broad-chested, but gaunt under the thick coat. The black and tan fur had faded to charcoal and ivory. Snow clung to its back and tail like it had been standing there for hours. A long scar curved down its left hind leg, the fur uneven around it. Its ears were upright. Its tail hung low, heavy with frost. It didn't bark. It didn't flinch. It simply watched. Brian narrowed his eyes. "That's not a coyote." "Nope," Cooper said, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "And that's not a stray either." They stepped out of the car in unison. The cold bit hard sharp enough to sting the eyes. Steam curled from their mouths as they approached slowly, boots sinking into fresh snow. The dog didn't move. Brian lifted a hand. "Hey there, buddy. You all right?" That's when the growl started. Low, steady, not angry, not wild, a trained warning a line in the snow. Cooper reached for his holster. "Brian." "I see it," Brian muttered. The growl deepened. The dog took one step back but didn't turn to run. Its legs spread slightly apart. Posture defensive, head low, eyes locked. Brian stopped. "He's warning us." "Or baiting," Cooper said. His voice tightened. "Hands on your weapon." Brian didn't argue. He unclipped the holster snap. The shepherd gave another sound, not quite a bark, more like a gravel-throated breath, worn from years. Its body tensed like a spring half broken, the kind of readiness that came from drills and danger, not instinct training. Cooper had drawn his sidearm now. "We need to call this in." Brian's pulse was steady, but his thoughts weren't. That scar, that posture, the way the dog shifted its weight, subtly keeping one side turned away. Brian took one step closer. "Don't," Cooper warned. "I'm not touching it." The wind picked up then, curling snow between them like mist. Brian noticed something at the dog's chest swinging slightly as it breathed. A collar. Not rope, not chain. A real leather collar, old and weathered. A brass tag, dulled with age, knocked against the metal buckle as the wind rocked it gently. Brian squinted. The tag turned just enough. The letters, though faint, were still legible. Service Dog, Unit 17. Brian froze. The dog didn't. It just stood there, as if waiting for the snow to decide who should speak first. The wind cut sharper now, sweeping fresh snow into eddies around the legs of the 2 officers as they stood frozen in the middle of Millstone Avenue. Brian stared at the tag, the brass dulled by age but legible enough under the faint gleam of dawn. Service Dog, Unit 17. His breath curled in front of him in shallow puffs. The dog stood motionless, not tense, not relaxed, just waiting. Cooper shifted beside him, gun still drawn but lower now. "You think it's real?" he muttered. Brian didn't answer right away. The world had gone too quiet. A car door slammed behind them, breaking the silence. A woman in her 50s stood near the sidewalk, her parka unzipped despite the cold, snow clinging to the curls escaping from beneath her knit hat. Her name was Martha Langley, a retired nurse who lived 3 blocks away. She had kind eyes that had grown tired from years of watching people leave hospital rooms alone. She wasn't nosy, but she had a habit of waking up early and walking when her insomnia got the better of her. Now she stood stock still, eyes wide behind fogged glasses. She stepped forward slowly, voice shaking but sure. "Oh my God! That's Shadow!" Brian snapped his gaze toward her. "What did you say?" She pointed at the dog, her voice suddenly louder. "That's Shadow! That K9, they said he died years ago, but I remember that face." The dog didn't react. Cooper blinked. "Is she serious?" Martha took another step forward, glancing at the pistol still in Cooper's hand. "You can put that down. He won't hurt you. That dog saved my neighbor's grandson. Don't you remember the Birchwood case?" Brian remembered. Of course he remembered. 5 years ago. A warehouse on Birchwood Street. A child trafficking operation busted wide open thanks to a single anonymous tip. What the public never knew was that the rescue had nearly failed, until a K9 unit, operating under Chief Daniel Keller, had tracked the scent of the last missing child through a tunnel network beneath the building. That K9's name was Shadow. Brian's hands trembled as he lowered his weapon. His fingers brushed the tag again. "Unit 17. His voice was almost a whisper. "He was my dad's." Cooper looked at him. "You never told me that. I didn't think it mattered. He went missing during that same raid. Everyone assumed he'd fallen through one of the tunnels or—" Brian stopped, his jaw clenched. "Or ran off after my dad got hit." Shadow, if that's who this was, remained still, as though watching a memory unfold in front of him. His breath came in slow, controlled huffs. But when Brian took a cautious step closer and said gently, "Come here, boy," the shepherd didn't move. No flinch, no reaction, just that same unreadable stare. "Maybe he doesn't recognize you," Cooper said. "It's been 5 years. Dogs forget." "No," Brian shook his head. "Not this one." He crouched, careful not to get too close. The street was quiet again, the snowfall softening every sound. "Come here," Brian tried again, his voice warmer. "It's okay." Still nothing. Then he remembered something. A command. Not one used in training manuals, but one his father had used in the backyard when Shadow got too wound up chasing birds. Something instinctual, something human. He took a breath. "Stay down, boy." For a moment, it was as if the world held its breath. Then the dog's ears twitched. Its body gave the slightest tremor, and slowly, with visible effort, it lowered itself into a laying position, chest pressed to the snow, head bowed. Cooper exhaled. "No way." Martha gasped softly. "He remembers." Brian swallowed hard. "Yeah, he remembers." The moment was broken by the sound of tires crunching snow behind them. A second cruiser pulled up beside the first. From it stepped a stocky officer in his early 40s with a thick mustache and a perpetual furrow in his brow. His name was Raymond Thorne, the current watch sergeant. Known for his sharp tongue and even sharper memory, he had served under Chief Keller and carried an unspoken loyalty to the old man. "What the hell's going on here?" he barked, stepping onto the icy road. "Dispatch said something about a loose dog?" Cooper turned, still stunned. "It's not just a dog." Thorne's eyes followed his gesture and locked onto the shepherd. His mouth opened, then closed again. Something flickered across his face: recognition, disbelief, maybe even guilt. "Is that—" Brian stood. "We think it's him." Raymond walked closer, slower now. The snow whispered under his boots. He crouched beside the dog, eyes softening. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "Shadow." The dog didn't react. Cooper crossed his arms. He only responded to a specific command. "What command?" Thorne asked. Brian looked at him. "Stay down." Thorne snorted softly. That sounds like something your dad would have come up with. Half his training was gut instinct. Brian nodded, and something tightened in his chest. Shadow lay quietly in the snow, not trembling, not resisting, just waiting, like he'd been waiting all this time, like every winter had brought him closer to this moment. The cruiser rumbled softly along the snow-covered street, tires humming against the frozen road as the sun finally breached the horizon. Pale light spilled over the rooftops of Whitestone, turning the icy world golden for a moment before retreating back to gray. In the back seat, the old German shepherd lay curled on a fleece blanket Brian had found in the trunk, his body stiff, his breaths slow but steady. The snow still clung to the fur on his legs, and his eyes, though open, flicked between the rear windows and the officers in front with a calm that felt unnerving. Brian kept glancing in the rearview mirror. You see the way he looks around? Not like he's nervous, like he's remembering. Cooper, who had insisted on driving, nodded once. Like he's cataloging. Every sound, every light, every exit. Yeah, Brian murmured, like he never stopped working. They pulled into the back entrance of the Whitestone Police Department, a modest brick building just off Main Street. It didn't look like much 3 stories, worn steps, a flickering exterior lamp, but it held more history than its walls could bear. A woman was already waiting by the back doors, crouched beside a metal pet carrier and a small table of supplies. She stood up as the cruiser approached. Dr. Emily Rhodes was Whitestone's only veterinary professional who still made house and station calls. In her early 40s, she was medium height, with pale skin and auburn hair always tied back in a braid so tight it seemed to pull the worry from her face. She had once wanted to be a wildlife vet in Montana, but after a car accident left her with a permanent limp in her right leg, she'd returned to her hometown, where the patients still had names and their owners still sent thank-you pies. Emily spoke to animals like they were co-workers, and spoke to people like she had limited patience. She watched as Brian opened the back door and gently coaxed the dog out. "So, this is the ghost," she said. "He's heavier than he looks," Brian said, lifting the shepherd's front paws down carefully. "And colder." Emily knelt beside the dog and gave him a cursory look. The shepherd didn't flinch, but his eyes locked onto hers, unmoving. "He's alert. Too alert. You got a name?" "Shadow," Brian said, almost without thinking. Emily didn't question it. She ran her hands along the dog's ribs, noting the space between bone and skin. Severely underweight, muscle loss in the back legs, old injury on the hind limb scar tissue, possibly tendon damage. You said 5 years? Missing, Cooper added. Presumed dead. Well, he's not dead, Emily muttered. But I wouldn't call this living either. She checked his paws. Frostbite on 1, maybe 2. I'll need a better look inside. Got a quiet room? Brian nodded. Interview room 3. Doesn't get much use since the new wing opened. They led Shadow inside through the back hallway. The warmth of the building seemed to melt the frost off his coat, but he didn't shake or shiver. He just walked with that slow, methodical gait, like a soldier returning from something unfinished. They placed him gently on a thick towel in the corner of the small interview room. Emily knelt beside him again, working in silence. She injected fluids under the skin and laid out some soft kibble in a shallow dish of water. Shadow sniffed it, then looked away. "He won't eat?" Cooper asked. "Not yet," Emily said. "Sometimes when they've been out that long, eating feels like surrender. Like if they start, they'll have to admit they've stopped surviving." Brian felt that land deep. He reached out and touched the edge of the collar again. His tag was still on. That's what stopped me. Just seeing it. Emily looked up. "Some dogs chew them off when they go rogue. He kept his on." Shadow turned his head toward Brian then, slow and deliberate. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Not recognition, not memory, but something adjacent. Something sacred. Cooper checked his watch. "I'll log the intake and grab a heater. That room gets cold." As he left, Brian stayed behind. Emily packed up her supplies and touched Brian's shoulder on the way out. "If he eats, call me. If not, just sit with him. That's sometimes all they want." The room emptied. The hum of the station heater kicked on overhead. Brian sat down in the chair across from the dog, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked around the room, paint peeling at the corners, old corkboard filled with long-forgotten memos. On the far wall, beneath a dusty flag, was a framed photo of Chief Daniel Keller, the last one taken before the Birchwood case. Brian stared at the picture a long moment, then turned back to the dog. "You were there that night," he whispered. "You saw it." The shepherd didn't move. Brian rose and opened the door. "I'll be right back." Down the hall, tucked behind the break room, was a memorial alcove. It wasn't much, just a glass case, a bronze plaque, and a small wooden shelf where officers left coins, patches, or written prayers. In the center sat a folded flag, a photograph, and a worn badge. Chief Keller's. Brian stood there a moment, then reached beneath the shelf and took out a soft, faded towel, one of his father's old ones, kept in the station for years, mostly forgotten. He returned to interview room 3. Shadow hadn't moved. Brian laid the towel down beside the dog and sat cross-legged beside him. Minutes passed. Then, without sound, Shadow adjusted his weight and placed his paw on the towel. He didn't lie down, not quite, but he leaned into it. Just enough. It was something. Later that night, as most of the station fell silent, Officer Karen Leary Short, sharp-tongued and loyal to a fault, passed by the room with a cup of vending machine coffee. She paused when she saw Brian on the floor beside the dog, and the dog staring up at the photo of his old partner. "Looks like he's still on duty," she murmured. Brian didn't respond. He couldn't. He just sat there, with the dog who hadn't forgotten. The snow returned that night, heavier than before, blanketing Whitestone in a fresh sheet of silence. By 1:34 a.m., most of the station was dark. A few desk lamps glowed in the report room, and the hum of the vending machine was the loudest sound for blocks. Officer Brian Keller was asleep on the floor of interview room 3, one arm across his chest, the other resting near the worn towel he had laid out hours earlier. Beside him, Shadow dozed lightly, his breathing steady but shallow. The old dog's body twitched occasionally, muscles firing in dreams too old to name, memories too deep to forget. The camera in the hallway outside buzzed softly as it caught the movement of the door creaking open. Shadow padded out silently, nose twitching, ears up. His gait was slow but purposeful, tail low, body tight with some invisible thread pulling him forward. The building didn't wake. Neither did Brian. By 1:52 a.m., the lobby doors clicked shut behind the German shepherd. Shadow disappeared into the storm. The next morning began with a scream from the front desk. Officer Karen Leary A., tough, silver-haired woman in her early 60s who moved like she was still in her 30s, was the one who discovered the security breach. She didn't rattle easily, but when she saw the empty blanket and the wide-open side door, she didn't hesitate to hit the alert buzzer. Brian came running barefoot, still in a t-shirt and sweats. "What happened?" "He's gone," Karen said, pointing at the monitor. "Your miracle mutt broke out." Brian stared at the screen. Shadow's escape had been quiet, calculated. No barking, no panic. The old dog had slipped out like a ghost who'd remembered he had unfinished business. "He's not just wandering," Brian muttered. "He's looking for something." It didn't take long to trace the footage. The town's traffic cameras picked him up crossing 5th and Grove, then turning down an alley off Coldwater Avenue. There was a final glimpse, Shadow pausing at the edge of a vacant lot, staring into the dark mouth of a warehouse before he vanished from sight. Brian cursed softly. "That building is condemned," Cooper said from behind him. Brian turned. "Since when are you here?" Cooper, already dressed and holding 2 cups of black coffee, handed one over. "Since I saw the dog wasn't where we left him." "You know that building?" "Better than you think." The warehouse was a square-shaped structure built in the late 1970s, once a freight depot, later repurposed by a construction firm called White Hollow Logistics, then abandoned after a fire gutted part of the western wall. It had sat untouched for years, boarded windows, rusted locks, and a chain-link fence more symbolic than secure. Brian rubbed his forehead. I remember it from the Birchwood case. My dad led the initial search. Cooper nodded. And found nothing. Karen interjected, You boys need to hurry. That dog's out there in freezing temps, and it's not just frostbite you need to worry about. The storm's getting worse. Brian grabbed his coat. Let's go. The warehouse sat in silence when they arrived, wind screaming through the broken slats in the roof. Snow piled along the fence line and half buried the front gate. There were paw prints, half melted, leading up to the heavy metal doors. Then came the smell. Sharp, acrid. Diesel, Cooper said. Fresh. Brian knelt beside the tracks. That shouldn't be here. No one's used this place in years. As they approached, something shifted in the shadows near the corner of the warehouse. A low, unmistakable sound echoed off the walls. A growl, guttural and urgent. Shadow. They rounded the corner and found him there, teeth slightly bared, body rigid. His hackles were raised and his nose pressed against a seam in the doorframe. He was cawing, a behavior rarely seen in older dogs, but unmistakable. He wasn't trying to break in. He was alerting. Brian stepped closer. Easy, buddy. Shadow didn't move. His nose stayed glued to the door. Cooper examined the wall. There's fresh scrape marks on the hinges. Someone's been in here. I thought it was abandoned. Cooper didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled quickly. What are you doing? Brian asked. Cross-referencing property records, Cooper muttered. I've seen this name before. White Hollow Logistics. Here. Transferred ownership 4 years ago. Guess to who? Brian leaned in. Detective Simon Hale. Brian blinked. You mean the guy who signed off on the final sweep after the Birchwood raid? Retired last year. Moved down to Arizona. Brian looked back at the warehouse. You think he missed something on purpose? I think Shadow doesn't forget smells. And I think this place was never really clean. They stood in silence for a long moment. Shadow had stopped growling. He now sat, unmoving, in front of the door, still as stone, ears tilted forward. Brian placed a hand on the old dog's back. Whatever's in there, he whispered. We're going to find it. Back at the station later that morning, Brian watched the footage again. Shadow in the hallway. Shadow pushing open the lobby door, Shadow vanishing into the snow. Cooper had retreated into the records room, where he now dug through digital archives under low light. Got it, Cooper finally called out. Brian entered to find him hunched over a monitor. There's a memo in the old Birchwood files, Cooper said. An inventory discrepancy. Evidence crate labeled Unfiled Materials, Warehouse West. Never logged, never recovered. Let me guess, Brian said. Signed off by Detective Hale. Cooper nodded, and never mentioned again. Brian exhaled slowly. He looked at the screen, then toward the hallway where Shadow now rested on a blanket, still breathing, still watching the front door like it might open to something long overdue. We need to open that warehouse, Brian said. Legally. I'll file the request, Cooper said, but it'll take days. Brian's gaze hardened. Then we'll find another way. That night, as the snow thickened and the streets emptied again, Shadow remained by the front of the station, eyes fixed out the window, waiting, not for rescue, but for someone to finally listen. The wind had lost none of its bite as the morning deepened over Whitestone. Snow still drifted lazily past the warehouse roof, but the silence that cloaked the building was tense now, watchful. Brian stood at the side entrance with Cooper and Officer Karen Leary beside him. Shadow was ahead of them by a few paces, alert and focused, his nose occasionally brushing the frozen ground. The building before them was a rotting skeleton of brick and rusted iron, with sagging beams and the scent of old oil soaked deep into the wood. Brian pushed the side door open with a groan of metal. Inside it was even colder than outside empty concrete, glass shards embedded in dust, and the faint echo of something older than the building itself. Shadow padded forward, ears perked. His steps were light but purposeful, like every corner of the space whispered something only he could hear. Karen Leary scanned the walls with her flashlight. This place gives me the creeps. Karen had been on the force for over 3 decades. Short and broad, with a raspy voice from years of chain smoking and shouting across crime scenes, she wasn't easy to shake. But this building made her pause. She gripped her flashlight tighter, her gaze sharp behind crow's feet-lined eyes. Shadow stopped suddenly. He sniffed at a patch of wall near the back of the warehouse where an old metal locker stood beside an exposed beam. He growled low, then raised a paw and raked it down the side of the locker. Brian approached, heart thudding. "He's found something." Cooper kneeled and examined the floor. "There's a seam in the concrete." Together they pushed the locker aside. Behind it, almost invisible beneath layers of dust and chipped paint, was a narrow trap door. The handle was rusted, but Cooper wedged a crowbar underneath and pulled. The floor gave way with a hiss of settling air. Beneath the trapdoor was a short set of stairs that led to a cramped, windowless room. The light flickered as Karen descended first, weapon drawn. Brian followed, and Shadow stayed right at his side, never hesitating. The room was about 12 feet square, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. Along one wall stood a long desk half buried under a tarp. Beside it, a filing cabinet leaned awkwardly on one leg. The place smelled of mildew and old metal. Karen peeled back the tarp. Underneath lay rows of surveillance monitors, their screens black but intact. Recording equipment, a tangled nest of wires, boxes labeled with masking tape, Case 247A, Fisher House, Jenkins Farm. All names tied to long-forgotten cases that never found resolution. Cooper opened one of the drawers. "Brian, these are unlogged files. Witness statements, photos. Some of them date back more than a decade." Brian flipped through the top folder. Inside were crime scene images he recognized from his rookie year cases labeled closed. But here, in these photos, were discrepancies. Evidence that had never made it to court. Contradictions buried under official reports. Shadow stood in the corner, nose to the floor. Then he turned abruptly, headed back up the stairs, and growled. Footsteps echoed above them. Karen was first to raise her weapon again, but Brian signaled for silence. They waited, the warehouse creaking around them. Then a voice came from the top of the stairs. "I figured someone would come back eventually." The figure that appeared at the top was hunched but tall, with a stoop built over decades of fatigue. George Milner, former lieutenant, now retired. 72, with a weathered face carved from too many years behind a badge and secrets too long held. His white hair was trimmed but unkempt, and his hands, once steady, trembled just slightly at his sides. He wore a heavy overcoat, but it couldn't hide the tension in his posture. Brian stepped forward. "You have some nerve coming back here." George exhaled slowly. "I never left. Not really." Shadow's growl deepened. The dog moved forward with unblinking focus, eyes fixed on George. The man didn't flinch, but his gaze shifted downward. "That dog," George muttered. "He shouldn't be here." "He never stopped guarding this place," Cooper said, "unlike you." Shadow padded closer. George tried to step back, but Shadow was already at his feet. He sniffed around the edge of the room, then suddenly turned to a dusty armchair tucked beside the stairwell. Without warning, he began to scratch violently at the seat cushion, his claws tearing through old fabric. Karen moved to pull him back, but Brian held her off. "Wait." Shadow barked once short, sharp, and then bit down on the side seam of the chair. With a yank, he tore the corner open. Something small clinked onto the floor, a medal, silver, slightly tarnished. The inscription on the back read, K9 Valor Award, Officer Shadow, Unit 17. Brian's voice was ice. "You said he ran." George looked away. "You said he abandoned my father. That he fled the scene, that he was presumed dead. That's what you told everyone." "I did what I had to," George replied, the tremor in his voice finally cracking the calm. "You don't understand what was at stake." "Then help me understand." George looked at the medal, then at Shadow, who now stood between them, tail stiff, ears forward, as if daring George to lie again. "I buried it," George said finally. "Because if people knew he survived, they'd start asking why the case files went missing, why the raid failed, why your father died in a room no backup ever reached." Brian's heart pounded. "You covered it up." George's eyes glistened. "I was ordered to, and I obeyed." They left the warehouse in silence, the cold pressing against their faces, the wind cutting deeper than before. Shadow walked just ahead, his steps slower now, but still purposeful. In the back seat of the cruiser, Brian held the metal in his hand. Shadow lay beside him, resting his chin on Brian's thigh. The weight of the small silver circle was heavier than it looked. There were wounds that never bled, but today, one of them had been reopened. The storm had calmed by midday, leaving behind a thin crust of ice and silence that blanketed the town like shame. Inside the Whitestone Police Department, George Milner sat alone in Interrogation Room 2. The chair creaked beneath his weight, the metallic table before him reflecting the sterile ceiling light. He stared down, not speaking, not fidgeting. A man no longer in control, just waiting. Brian Keller stood outside the one-way glass, arms folded, listening through a wireless receiver. His jaw was tight, but his eyes remained fixed not on George, but on the audio waveform moving across the laptop beside him. A line of red showed the recording was live. The tiny device he'd hidden beneath the interview room's lip hours earlier had done its job. Across the hall, Cooper sat alone in the old briefing room, back to the wall, staring at the floor with a printed transcript of George's recorded confession spread before him. His hands didn't move, but his eyes did, scanning and rescanning every line like they might rearrange themselves into something less painful. His badge lay on the table, face down. Karen Leary entered quietly, a coffee in each hand. "You all right?" Cooper didn't answer at first. Then he looked up. "I used to quote him." Karen, seasoned and blunt, handed him a cup and sat. "A lot of us did. He came to my academy graduation. Told me the best officers protect the truth, even when it's ugly." He gave a dry laugh. "Turns out he couldn't even protect a dog." Karen didn't say anything for a moment. Then, softly, "You don't have to carry the weight of his choices." Cooper's voice dropped. "But I believed in him. I believed in what he stood for." Karen sipped her coffee. "Then stand for it louder than he did." In the evidence room, Brian cataloged the tape, logging it under a temporary case file. Keller Internal 06G Milner Confession. He paused before hitting Save, fingers resting on the keyboard. The room was dim, a single desk lamp illuminating old case folders and sealed boxes. Dust danced in the beam like quiet witnesses. His phone buzzed. A text from Cooper. "I want to reopen the Birchwood file, every piece." Brian smiled faintly and replied, "You lead it." Shadow lay nearby, curled beside the desk. His ears twitched when Brian moved, but his body didn't rise. Instead, his eyes followed Brian slowly, watchful but no longer guarded. "You knew," Brian whispered, reaching down to run his hand along Shadow's back. "The whole time you remembered." Shadow didn't respond with a bark or a wag, but the pressure of his body leaned subtly into Brian's hand. It was enough. An hour later, George Milner was brought out of Interrogation Room 2 in handcuffs. 2 state officers had arrived. Silent, professional men in dark suits with measured steps and tight jaws. George didn't fight the cuffs. He didn't speak. His eyes flicked to Brian once, then to Shadow lying in the hallway. The dog raised his head as George passed, ears forward, no growl, no movement, just gaze. And when George hesitated for half a breath, Shadow slowly turned away, curling back down onto his paws without looking back. The message was clear. You're not worth remembering. That evening, in the locker room, Cooper changed out of his uniform slowly. The room was empty except for the buzz of an overhead light. He stood in front of the mirror, shirt half-buttoned, hands unmoving. His reflection stared back at him with hollow eyes and an expression he barely recognized. Disillusionment, disappointment, and underneath it all, quiet rage. He reached into his locker and pulled out a framed photo tucked in the back, a younger Cooper, smiling, shaking hands with George Milner. The inscription on the back read, "To Cooper Diaz, A, Cop, Whitestone can be proud of, IGM." He stared at it for a long moment, then placed it face down in the trash bin. When he stepped into the hallway, Brian was waiting. You okay? No, Cooper replied honestly, but I'm ready. Brian handed him a folder. Reactivation request for the Birchwood case. DA's office is reviewing the confession. You'll be lead investigator. Cooper took the folder. Let's clear it all. Later that night, Brian sat in the memorial alcove alone. The lights were dimmed for evening shift, and the glass case shimmered faintly. He looked at his father's photo, the folded flag, the badge. He didn't run, Brian said aloud. You were right to trust him. Shadow sat beside him, tail curled neatly over his paws, eyes on the same glass. He didn't move, but Brian could feel the warmth of him there, the weight of a loyalty that had never faltered. For the first time in 5 years, the plaque didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a beginning. The morning sun broke cleanly over Whitestone for the first time in weeks, casting long golden rays across the town square. Snow still lay thick on the sidewalks, but it shimmered now rather than suffocating like the town itself had taken a deep breath after years of holding it in. Folding chairs lined the plaza in front of the Whitestone courthouse, flanked by flags that waved gently in the light breeze. A wooden platform had been erected near the war memorial, dressed with a simple banner, "Welcome home, Officer Shadow." By 9:00 a.m., the square was full. Families arrived in thick coats and knitted scarves, bundled children perched on shoulders, the elderly seated in the front with wool blankets on their laps. There were shopkeepers in aprons, mail carriers on break, high school students with homemade signs, and veterans in uniform. The entire town had come, not out of obligation, but something deeper: gratitude, curiosity, closure. Shadow sat at the edge of the stage, stoic and still, wearing a navy blue service vest freshly tailored to his old frame. The patch on the side read, "Retired, K9 Unit 17." His coat had been brushed, and though the gray in his fur could not be erased, he looked sharper now, more present. His ears twitched at every sound, his amber eyes scanning the crowd not with fear, but with measured calm. Beside him stood Brian Keller, dressed in formal patrol blues. His chest bore his father's old commendation bar, polished and reattached the night before. He didn't wear his hat. He wanted to stand eye to eye with the people who had known his father, who now gathered to honor the dog who had once walked beside him. The MC was a soft-spoken man named Mayor Elias Rowe, mid-50s, short, with a silver beard and a tan wool coat that made him look more like a schoolteacher than a politician. Mayor Rowe had known Daniel Keller, had shared beers with him at softball games. And though public speaking never came easily to him, today he stood straighter. He cleared his throat at the microphone. "There are few things more sacred than service," he began, "and fewer still more enduring than loyalty. Today, we honor a soul who embodied both and never asked for anything in return." He gestured to Shadow, who sat calmly as the crowd erupted into applause. In 2018, Officer Shadow was listed as missing in action during the Birchwood raid, a day that cost us our chief and nearly cost us the truth. Today, we recognize not only his survival, but his unwavering commitment to his mission, a mission that outlived the uniform, outlived the command, outlived even memory. Cooper stood near the stage steps, not in uniform, but in a dark charcoal suit. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The anger he'd carried in recent days had softened now into something else: resolve, maybe. Or perhaps reverence. He had helped coordinate the event with exacting care, double-checking every name on the invitation list, making sure the media stayed outside the core ceremony, and that no one tried to turn it into politics. Mayor Rowe stepped aside, allowing a slim woman in her mid-30s to approach the microphone. Emma Loring, once a scared child, now a poised elementary school counselor, had been one of the kids Shadow helped save 5 years ago. Tall, freckled, with fiery red curls tied back in a simple braid, she spoke clearly, though her voice trembled when she looked at the dog seated before her. "I don't remember everything from that night," she said, "but I remember the cold, and I remember the fear, and then I remember his eyes, just like they are now. He didn't bark, he didn't bite, he just stood between us and the bad men. She knelt at the edge of the stage and touched Shadow's paw gently. "You didn't leave us. Not really. And now, we don't leave you." A quiet sob rose from somewhere in the front row. Brian stepped forward to take the podium next. He didn't have notes. He didn't need them. "When my father died, I lost more than a parent. I lost direction. I didn't know then what Shadow had done, what he kept doing. I do now, and I promise you he will never be forgotten again." He looked down at Shadow, then out into the crowd. "I'm taking responsibility for his care. From this day forward, Shadow is home, not in memory, not in legend, but right here, with me, as he should have been." Applause rose again, this time louder, layered with emotion. Then a boy ran forward from the crowd no more than 8 years old, wearing a red scarf too large for his small frame. He paused at the stage steps, eyes wide. His mother called for him to stop, but he didn't. He climbed onto the platform, approached Shadow with reverence, and wrapped his arms gently around the dog's neck. Shadow didn't move. The crowd hushed. Then another child followed, a girl of about 10 with braces and snow boots, her fingers trembling as she reached to stroke Shadow's head. She knelt beside him, burying her face in his fur. A third child came. Then a fourth. Children Shadow had saved. Children who had grown. Children who still remembered. Brian stepped back, letting it happen. Cooper turned away for a moment, blinking fast. Even Karen Leary, standing near the rear, dabbed her eyes with the edge of her scarf. There were no medals pinned that day, no plaques handed out, no speeches about courage carved in granite. Only a dog, once forgotten, now surrounded by those he had saved, silent, strong, and finally seen. As the ceremony drew to a close and the crowd began to disperse, Brian knelt beside Shadow and whispered, "You did good, partner." Shadow's eyes drifted up to meet his, and for the first time in days his tail thumped once against the stage. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The snow had begun to melt, one thin trickle at a time, retreating from the rooftops and sidewalks as if the town had finally decided to thaw. Whitestone was shedding its winter coat, revealing the bones of old porches, rusting mailboxes, and the familiar creak of pine trees bending toward spring. On the quiet end of Briar Hill Road stood a small blue house with peeling white shutters and a front porch that had seen better paint but never lost its dignity. It was the kind of home where porch lights were left on for late returns, and mugs of coffee steamed on the railing at dawn. Shadow stood at the edge of that porch every morning. He was slower now, his hind legs stiff with age, and his hearing not as sharp as it once was, but he rose with the sun and took his place at the top of the steps as if he'd been assigned the post. No leash, no command, just instinct, habit, honor. Brian Keller stepped onto the porch beside him, coffee in hand, wearing flannel pajama pants and a Whitestone PD sweatshirt faded from too many washes. His hair was unkempt, and his stubble hadn't seen a razor in 2 days. But there was peace on his face, a quiet that hadn't been there for years. "Morning, old boy," he said. Shadow didn't look at him. His eyes were on the street, watching the joggers, the school bus pulling up at the corner, the neighbor's cat slinking between bushes, always alert, always listening. "You know you're retired now, right?" Brian added, sipping from his mug. Shadow's tail gave a faint thump. Inside the house, the living room had been rearranged to accommodate the dog's needs. A thick orthopedic bed rested beneath the front window, lined with a fleece blanket and surrounded by chew toys, most of which remained untouched. On the wall above the couch hung 2 photographs. One of Chief Daniel Keller in full dress uniform, hand on the shoulder of a young, alert German shepherd with jet-black fur, and beside it, a more recent photo Brian kneeling beside Shadow at the ceremony, both looking toward something beyond the frame. In both images, father and son, man and dog, eyes forward, always watching the door. Brian glanced at those photos often. It reminded him that this was more than grief. It was legacy. That afternoon, Brian sat at a folding table inside the old community gymnasium. The building had once served as a storm shelter, then a polling place, and now it echoed with barks and the excited chatter of volunteers in matching Navy t-shirts that read Shadow Watch, Canine Rescue Initiative. Brian tapped a clipboard as he watched two new recruits, a shaggy mutt with one ear missing named Tank and a high-energy lab named Nellie Being, guided through obedience drills by volunteers. Cooper entered carrying a box of supplies. He wore a ball cap pulled low and a jacket dusted with dog fur. His expression was less rigid now, more grounded, like a man who had burned something inside him and found a better way to use the ashes. "New batch of harnesses," he said, setting the box down. Brian smiled. "How's Emma doing with the scent work?" "She's a natural," Cooper replied. "The kids love her, too." Emma Loring had joined the initiative a week earlier, bringing with her not only a gift for dogs but a quiet authority that kept the teens in the youth outreach program respectful and engaged. She didn't raise her voice, but when she spoke, they listened. Shadow had taken to her quickly, nudging her side every time she entered the room. Brian looked around. "I didn't think this many people would sign up." Cooper shrugged. "Everyone needs something to believe in." They both turned toward the far side of the gym, where a large poster hung above the registration table. It showed Shadow standing tall in front of the courthouse beneath the words, "Train with purpose. Serve with heart. Shadow Watch." Later that evening, Brian returned home, exhausted but fulfilled. He dropped his keys in the ceramic dish by the door and was met by the soft patting of paws on hardwood. Shadow greeted him with a low grunt, tail wagging slowly. Brian scratched behind his ears and leaned down to whisper, "We're building something, partner. In your name." Shadow followed him into the living room and settled onto the bed beneath the window, nose resting on his front paws. Outside, the last traces of sunlight were fading into the pink-blue haze of dusk. Brian sat on the couch, gaze drifting again to the photographs on the wall. For a long moment, he just stared. Then he said softly, "He'd be proud of you." Shadow didn't move, but Brian swore he saw the tip of the dog's tail flick once. That night, Brian stood at the kitchen counter, scribbling notes into a leather-bound notebook labeled Shadow Watch Curriculum. Training ideas, schedules, behavior assessments. A paw print sticker was placed carefully on the cover one of the kids had given it to him earlier in the week. The wind howled outside, but the house stayed warm. At the front of the house, Shadow stirred. He rose slowly, stretched, then walked to the door and sat, staring out the window, his breath fogging the glass. Brian joined him a moment later. They stood in silence, two silhouettes in the glow of the porch light, a man and a dog who had never stopped standing guard. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They arrive quietly on four tired paws in the eyes of a forgotten hero, or in the silent loyalty of a heart that never gave up. Shadow didn't need to speak to remind us of something sacred, that faithfulness never fades, and even when the world forgets you, God remembers. Maybe you're carrying something heavy today, maybe you feel unseen, but if this old dog could walk through snow in silence for 5 long years and still find his way home, then there's hope for all of us. Hope lives in second chances, in unexpected reunions, in the light beyond the dark. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that every life matters, every soul deserves dignity, and every broken thing can be restored, then type Amen in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of love, loyalty, and the quiet ways God still moves. And may God bless you and your family today and always.